Hello again, everyone, and welcome to Align, Engage, Fulfilled. I can't believe it, but we're already halfway through our second season, which is absolutely insane. Now, if you haven't already, please make sure to subscribe and share the podcast so that we can continue to help more people transform their businesses and their careers. All right, so in our last episode, we talked to Casey Devine about the infrastructure of engagement. And in that episode, Casey told us that infrastructure is the enablement, and that even if you believe in a company's mission, broken, clunky systems will create enough friction to kill your engagement. But what happens when your infrastructure doesn't even have a zip code? Now, we hear executives demanding a return to office because they claim that culture and collaboration can only happen in cubicle filled spaces with beautiful fluorescent lights shining from above. They blame remote work for a lack of engagement, but is the problem really the distance, or is the problem that we're trying to force an outdated management playbook onto a modern reality? My guest today never learned that old playbook. He went into entrepreneurship straight out of college and built his company from scratch. Brandon Fortino is the founder of Fortino Studios, a content and brand strategy firm that helps high level entrepreneurs and CEOs turn their expertise into magnetic personal brands. Now, Brandon and I actually go way back to just a few years ago. We met in college through a business fraternity. And full disclosure, when I first transitioned from my 9 to 5 into self employment, Brandon was the one I hired to help me share my expertise through content and to tell my story during that transitional period. And the truth is that I hired him to help me amplify my voice, but he really helped me find my courage and confidence instead. All that to say that I've experienced the impact of his work firsthand. But I didn't bring Brandon onto the show to talk about marketing. I brought him on to talk about leadership. Brandon manages a fully remote team spread across 4 different time zones. He's a Gen Z founder, proving that you don't need a physical office to build a highly engaged, highly aligned team. So today we're going to ask, how do you maintain alignment when your team is never awake at the same time? How do you keep your team engaged when they're siloed at home and are hours ahead or behind their team? So without further ado, let's get into it. Brandon, welcome to the show.
Excited to be here, Clarence.
Me too. I'm honestly glad that we're finally able to make this happen. We
Yes.
must have talked about getting on each other's podcasts a few times now, so I'm
Yeah,
glad it's finally happening.
I love that. And I think, kinda you said it well, beautifully said, like, in terms of how today's work culture has changed, and I think not a lot of people talk about that enough of
Yeah.
how really that has transformed, but so excited to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you. So to start, I want to start with a powerful visual about your childhood that truly I stole from your LinkedIn.
Sure.
You wrote, and I quote, "Before I spoke English, I spoke the language of story." Growing up in Jakarta, I was captivated by the way Western movies could move audiences across language barriers with nothing but powerful visuals. Even when I couldn't understand the dialogue, I understood the message. I picked up my first camera at 14 and never looked back. Storytelling became my way of building bridges, creating opportunities, and setting myself apart. So, this concept of story, Brandon, has been a massive anchor for us this season, which is what really caught my attention as I was learning more and more about you outside of what I already knew about you. In episode 4, my guest, John Elbing, challenged us to move from passive storytelling to active story building.
Hmm.
And then in episode 5, after that, John Formica reminded us that a story is just an idea until your employees actually bring it to life as an experience. Today, you're bringing stories to life through content. Tell us about this full circle journey. What was that journey like going from learning English through movies and story to now helping high level entrepreneurs tell theirs through content?
Yeah, I think that's pretty much sums it up growing up in Indonesia, we didn't speak English. We speak Indonesian as a main language. But
Mm,
I've always fascinated. I've always watched Western movies when I was little, things like what we all as a child would watch, Toy
mm,
Story, Monsters Inc. But
mm,
at the time, however old I was at the time, I wasn't old enough to be able to read the captions and the translations as well. So because of that, I couldn't even read as fast. So what did I end up doing is just looking at visually of what actually happens. And obviously at the time I didn't know what I was doing. I'm just kind of like getting that story kind of through the things that I experienced. I
yeah,
was able to learn and kind of piece together of what is the message of that movie. But looking back, that has been one of my ways that I've able to experience that culture and even learn from because I've thought about this as I was starting my, journey back then when I was 14, bringing up cameras and all that stuff. Is it's such a powerful tool where you don't need to be able to understand what they're saying if you can
mm,
actually resonate with that story, whether it's through visuals, ideally through audio if you can understand them, right? But at the time, it was fascinating to me through visuals because you could convey a lot of things visually and people will
yeah,
understand what it is. Like if
yeah,
you were to say, watch some of the old films without any, sound, you could still understand what's going on, what's happening.
right,
And so that kind of concept really fascinated me at the time. It's like, how are you able to send a message, whatever message it is, across different barriers? And if you can send a message with somebody that don't even understand what you're talking about and still kind of get that through, I think that's a powerful tool.
yeah,
And when I started the business about, a couple of years ago, I guess it's like 6 years ago now around, um, there's always this disconnect, I think, where people are thinking like they should tell people, whereas like really like what do we need to show people, right? What do we need to tell about your stories that people actually understand it from
mm.
just telling it? So that's kind of like really what became the foundation, really just like learning the language through films and all that stuff. But I find it fascinating, and I still do it till today too. But again, it's a whole. Sometimes I would watch. I have seen this experience like a couple of times already where I used to watch something when I was little and I have a whole new interpretation of like what that movie was.
Mm,
And then today I would rewatch it again, understanding the actual things that are actually meant to be said. And I'm
yeah,
like, oh, I was missing context or I was missing like little details. But overall, like when I was watching as a little, like I understood what happening. You know what I mean? I
yeah,
love Star Wars, for example. Like those are very complex movies
for
to
sure.
watch when you're like, 6 or 7, years old, right? But
Yeah,
I still was able to understand it, even though I didn't understand the language and the words that they're saying on screen. So
I love that,
yeah.
and I think you spoke to what a lot of us experience in terms of just the context and how we understand it as a child and how we understand it now that we've gone through a little bit more of life. And I want to dig a little bit later into that and how that's affected your leadership. But what I really appreciate about what you just said, what you just shared, is it resonates so much with me because you talked about your why just now, right? Like why you're doing what you do now relates back to an experience, this like transformative experience that you had as a child, which is very similar to what I went through because I was born in the Philippines,
Hmm.
so from Asia like you, and I came here when I was about 10 years old, and I went through this experience as a child of like going from a third world country to a first world country and speaking a whole nother language and having to learn a whole different language. And
Hmm.
I wasn't similar to you in that like I didn't learn English necessarily through watching movies or films or story. I learned it by just being thrown into the fire, thrown into the wolves of like, okay, you're going to school now, you have to learn English. And I just kind of started picking things up. But it was this transformation that I experienced at that age that really created this why of what I do now. And I really only realized this maybe a year ago after reflecting on my journey going from 9 to 5 to the self-employment world of like, okay, what do I do? What do I want to do? Why do I want to do it? And realizing that everything I've done throughout my career has been about helping other people through their growth and transformation, because for me that was such a powerful thing to experience as a child of like literally going from one life to another.
Yeah.
And so I think that's so fascinating that you share that because it just resonates so much with me because I think people don't realize that even as young as you have, Like, I mean, I realized it at 36. And so I think there's something so powerful in that story, in that transformation that you realize is the fuel to what you do.
100%. I think like transformations like that. I mean, was fortunate enough to experience something like that, right? Whereas, some of us that wasn't born in the United States or, grew up in this kind of environment having to go through that experience. And it's interesting to see, even from my experience and yours, probably we have different takeaways of
Yeah,
how that experience has shaped us in terms of what we do. So
for
I'm
sure.
always like kudos for everybody that has experienced that kind of transformation because it's not an easy transformation, but it is
No,
something that for sure affects how we do things and how we operate, either as business owners, as a person in community, or anything like that.
100%.
Yeah.
Okay, so before we talk about your global team, I want to rewind to where we first met because we
Sure.
have to, right?
Yeah.
So in our college business fraternity, I'm not sure if I could even mention the name, but we were both in Delta Sigma Pi, which is a
Yeah.
business fraternity, and that organization was really designed to teach us about leadership and these foundational business skills. Looking back, did that experience actually prepare you to jump straight into entrepreneurship right out of college? Or did you find
Mhm.
that the real world of leadership required a whole different playbook?
Yeah. I mean, I think definitely to say that it didn't help at all would be probably a lie. You know what I mean? It definitely did help. Same goes with what people like usually say. Did college ever help you? Does your degree ever help you? If it didn't, then I think, what are you doing? Right? You're
Right,
not looking at it
right.
the right way. So I think to a certain degree, it did help in a way. Now, when we were in that fraternity, I was able to take on different roles within it in the executive team as different hats. It's marketing, technology, socials, all the different stuff that I think add up to that skill set of leadership. I think if I'm looking back and I could tell myself about what skills am I actually building, I think the leadership skill is not like it's a very linear skill set.
Yeah.
If anything, you build a lot of smaller skill sets. And the question is, how do you translate that into different contexts and to different environments?
Hmm.
And I think that's probably the biggest things that I've learned throughout that experience is, let's say, when I was the director of marketing for the fraternity at the time, I was tasked to run campaigns, do X, Y, and Z. And now in my business, did that help me on how to run campaigns? Kind of, but also it's more so like the transferable skills of like, how do I direct others? How do I delegate some tasks to others so that I don't do it myself? And even when I jumped into entrepreneurship, that found to be difficult to do.
Hmm.
Right. I think there's a lot of things that we had to face. I always thought in the very beginning that I am the best person at taking videos and photos and editing them and really like doing that until I realized like, oh, there's other people that are better than me.
Hmm.
And I'm like, how do I get them to work together with me and kind of like motivate them to, all this different stuff.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting because when we talk about leadership, like people always think about one linear skill set, whereas it's a
Hmm.
combination of a lot of different smaller skill sets that adds throughout time. Like, how do you talk to a person. Now, going deeper into that, right? If we want to go into like MBTI and all that different stuff, how do we talk into this certain personality of a person? How do we talk to this type of motivation of a person, right? How do we communicate when things are good, when things are not good? How do we communicate feedback, right? So, from my experience, I think definitely I learned from there. Uh, I just didn't know when I would be able to use that use case. How about you? Did you think that you learned something from it?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is coming from somebody who, I mean, as you know, I went into it as a 35-year-old fully grown man. And at that point, I already had experience under my belt in the corporate world. But what I like about the environment, I think for anybody, regardless of age or whatever season of life you're in, is that it gives you an opportunity to experiment, to
Yes.
explore these, different nuanced ways of doing things in terms of entrepreneurship, in terms of leadership and business,
Mhm.
and like without the high stakes,
Yep.
right? Like you have a chance, you have an opportunity to work with people from different backgrounds, different experiences, different expertise, who are very much just like anybody you would work with in the corporate world, right? Or in the quote unquote real world. And truthfully, a lot of the college students in these organizations are even more mature than some of the people who are out in the real world that you work with. So it really puts you in this, for a lack of a better term, incubator,
Yep.
where you have an
Exactly.
opportunity to really test yourself as a leader, test yourself as a team member without the high stakes of your paycheck, your
Right.
benefits, like all these
Mhm.
major things that you have to deal with as an adult. So in that sense, I think it is a really powerful experience. The reason why I ask is for two reasons. One, we have a lot of our audience is in that kind of 25 to 30 range who are
Mhm.
kind of transitioning from their college education to the quote unquote real world. And I think that's a powerful lesson to learn of like, and even I think we have some stragglers who are still kind of in that college experience. So I think it's powerful for them to recognize the power of taking on these kinds of opportunities. But on the flip side, I think it also speaks to your transition into entrepreneurship right out of college. Aside from being in that business fraternity, you did an internship stint at Ascent,
I
but
did.
was that your only exposure to the corporate 9 to 5?
It is crazy enough.
So,
I mean, I've had jobs before that. My first job was actually at Hollister in
oh,
retail.
okay.
I
Tell
was
me
in
why I can see that.
I don't know. I was the only Asian guy in the whole city, maybe. And I was an expert jeans folder. You know what I mean? I should put that on my
Nice. Yep.
LinkedIn. But yeah, so the internship at Ascent was my corporate experience, and also my experience when I was used to work at a marketing agency. Tenuity was also my other corporate work experience, I guess. And this is all during 2019, 2020, 2021 era, during that whole COVID remote work kind of situation.
So I ask because
Mm,
for a lot of people who go into entrepreneurship, they typically have at least 3 to 5 years of experience in the corporate world or in the 9 to 5
mhm,
structure
mhm.
before they go into entrepreneurship, right? Because that's a traditional path that we're told to take. Do you feel that not being tainted by that kind of or that length of time in the corporate structure has positively or negatively influenced the way that you run your business today?
That's a great question. I would say I would say neither. I don't think it helped nor destroy. I think it's one of those like what if could happen. You know what I mean? I think each position have their own pros and cons, and I think that's as I'm more getting into the entrepreneurship world. I think every decision always have a pros and cons and
Sure.
like an
Yeah.
opportunity cost to it, right? And I got into entrepreneurship in the beginning thinking I was going to go through that route, the
Mm,
corporate route, doing, a couple of years and then get into entrepreneurship. At the time, I was able, number one, I was kind of forced to do it because of
mm,
income purposes. I was like, I
yeah.
need to make extra money. If not, I need to drop out of college and actually work.
Sure.
And number two, fortunately, during that time, I was given the opportunity to have a skill set already that I've been developing over the years. So I think, did it positively or did it negatively affect it? I don't think it one way or the other. I think there are advantages if you are in the corporate space and especially in a specific skill set that you see yourself eventually wanting to get into entrepreneurship, but you get to get paid as you learn per se. That's kind of like how I
Yeah.
see it. And that is a legitimate path. And a lot of entrepreneurs took that path. They get to learn and they get paid. And then after several years of learning, they actually do it. Or you might just figure it out along the way. I think that's the path that I took. And it's not like a lot of people like, oh, worry about that or like the path. But I really believe like today there's so many tools and I call it like tertiary education kind
Yeah.
of places where, whether it's courses, coaching, all of that. I highly believe in those. I always shell out budget every single year to do that because I think that is the fastest way you can learn from someone. I mean, they always say like there's two ways of learning in general. The first one is by trying it out, figure out what's not working, and keep trying until it actually works, whatever
Mm,
it is you're doing. Or number two, you learn from somebody else that has already done it. Watch for the pitfalls, and then that way you can go there faster, right?
yeah. I love
So
that.
I think there's no wrong answer, and there's also no right answer to that. I think it just depends on where you are in your situation, and uh, you know, I'm kind of glad the way I did it because at the time, leaving my internships, I was about to get offered some sort of full time salary into it, but I took a shot at myself. And the way I look at it too, like the younger you are, do you have kind of all these time and opportunities?
Yeah.
So why not just take the risk? Because I think my personal belief is like until you're about I don't know maybe like 40, then really like the thing is you take a lot more. Well, no, until you're about
Yeah,
that age, like, you could take a lot of risks without really, kind of like, again, age is just a number, but like the point of it is like you got to look at what your batting average is in a way of like what are you risking when you're taking this
yeah,
bet, because there's always a risk in the table, right?
yeah,
If you can create a situation where the stakes is very low and the reward is infinitely high, then I would take that
yeah,
bet, right? So
for sure. No,
yeah.
I mean, honestly, you're speaking to exactly what I went through in the past year of like
Mhm,
I mean, I spent the last 20 years in the corporate 9 to 5 and really, chased the climbing of the ladder like we're told to do, worked my way up to the C suite. And then I got to the C suite and now I was like, well, dang, like I don't even feel like I really want to be here.
mhm,
And then I made this decision to move from that high level role to self employment and the uncertainty of entrepreneurship. And one of the biggest things I had to contend with is the risk, the impact that it would have now that I have a family, I have a wife, I have a child, I have like all these things that I have to think about. Whereas to your point, when you are able to make it at a much younger age, the risk is so much less, right?
mhm,
And so for anybody listening who is at that point, like I definitely encourage you to consider taking that chance on yourself because it's so powerful. And one of the things I will always remember thinking about when I was making that transition is I wish that I did it sooner. Even now, every day,
mhm.
I have this constant feeling of I wish I did this sooner because I would be able to do so much more and have so much more impact if I didn't
Yeah.
have the constraints that I have today. So I think you make a very critical point there.
I'll add to that though. I think that feeling of like wishing like things could have happened sooner will always carry with you.
For
Even
sure.
myself, like, oh man, I wish, and maybe I didn't go to college. Maybe I wish I would have find out about this thing earlier in the day, earlier in the years. I think that feeling will never go away. So it's
Yeah.
kind of like one of those things where you don't want to just like keep sitting on that feeling. But at the same time, what I think a key point is also every position that you are in have an advantage.
Hmm.
It's like, I don't know if you play chess, but I used to be big
Yeah.
on playing chess.
Yeah.
Like every position, whatever moves you play, there's always an advantage, right? Whereas, yes, if you're younger, you have an advantage of time. That is you have, and what is your disadvantage? Is experience,
Hmm.
right? Your disadvantage of skill and experience. Whereas if you have, let's say going through the route of 10, 20 years of the corporate world and understanding a specific industry, what's your advantage? Your advantage is that you're probably wiser. You've seen you have a more knowledge, and you're probably not going to make the same mistake that somebody that is younger would have make because you know what to watch out for. And there's
Hmm.
obviously cons to that too. So I think
Yeah.
there's always a pros and a cons on whatever kind of card that we're dealt with. And the
Yeah.
name of the game of entrepreneurship is like, let's look at the cards and see how we can play this to our best hand. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? So
I love
yeah.
that. Like mature is not even the right word, but for a lack of a better term in my brain right now, like that's a very mature perspective. And I think it's maybe I'll say it's a little bit refreshing because I think for a lot of people who are younger, whether it's millennials or Gen Z, that's not a perspective that a lot of us have. But I think it's such a powerful perspective to have to really navigate kind of the world that we're in right now.
Mhm.
And one of the things that I've always like appreciated and admired about you is that you evidently have really good head on your shoulders. I'm not just talking about the hair. I mean, like it's
We
so
have similar hair.
evident. I know, right? It's so evident that like you have taken this lifelong learning approach to life and to your entrepreneurship, which I think is evident not just in the way that you speak, but in the way that you approach your work. So let's dive a little bit into that
Sure.
to learn about how you take all these things that you learn through either of the two ways that you described earlier, and like really dive into the nuance of how you apply it.
Sure.
Because out of your college experience, you eventually built this incredible company, but you're not doing it on your own. You have a team of people behind you, but you lead them across 4 different time zones. Essentially, you lack the traditional dialogue of just tapping someone on the shoulder or reading their body language in a physical conference room.
Yeah.
How has that early realization that you can communicate a powerful message without traditional methods shape the way that you're leading your team today? Like when you can't physically be in the same room, how do you use this language of story to project your vision internally so that your team can actually experience it?
Yeah, and to preface this, like the way we got it running now is not how we got it running in the beginning. Like it takes a lot of trial and error, a lot of different things in terms of like how do we navigate that. That's always one of the big operational like challenge that we have, and something that we continue solving every single day, even till today. Like with the benefits of some AI agents and Claude and
Yeah.
all that different stuff, like we're still evaluating how we can make our operations better. So that's something that we still keep on undergoing. So this is, I'm telling you from perspective of like what we have right now, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Um, I think, you know, having a team really, in my opinion, really what separates like when you're a solopreneur into someone like an entrepreneur that actually be able to lead. And somebody told me that a long time ago because when I first started from between 2020 until about 2022, I was basically a one person team. I was like doing everything myself and work, 15 hours a day every day. And so I decided there must be a better way, right? And so I looked into different models and how people do it and eventually came across this model where we outsource our post production overseas. And I'm like, okay, let's test that out. And overseas, we have places like the Philippines or Indonesia to outsource this too. And being Indonesian myself, I'm like, this is great. Like, this is part of my goals of wanting to, you know, hire my own people as per
Yeah.
se in a way of like providing job opportunities. And there's an arbitrage in terms of the currencies, right? I'm like, okay, this is financially sound decision from a business perspective. And then the managerial perspective like comes into reality and like, okay, how do we do this? Like,
Yeah.
you know, and the way we're able to do that right now, we have our team in uh, Southeast Asia, in the USA, and also in Latin America across, well, 4 different countries. So really like navigating through that is something that I think number one, we have to establish what is the standard and kind of really know how to work around different cultures and different almost like expectations of work too. Because
Yeah.
ideally, for example, we see it as different departments and we see it as things that are like, how does each department need to connect and communicate to the other, for
Mm.
example? So let me dive deeper into that. Uh, the way the current hierarchy of the organization goes, there's me, there's Stephanie, our director of ops, and we also have Bagas, which is our post production manager, which leads our post production team, and then we have folks from Latin America as well, Luisa, that is in charge of our social media. Now, everything that is in the Southeast Asia team, the post production team, do we really need them to be on during our time? We decided like not really,
Mm.
because I don't need to sit with them next to them in an edit of a video when they're editing something and kind of tap on their shoulders per se,
Yeah.
right? So we kind of bake that into how we plan out the deadlines and stuff like that. Whereas like, okay, each video is typically done in about 48 hours if it's a short form, and if it's long form, it's more a couple of days. So okay, we don't need to. We set the standard. Like as long as we complete work by this deadline, we're good. So just expecting that, communicating that deadline and communicating that expectation to that team is important. Now, on the other team or the Latin America team and also the post production manager, we kind of need to kind of communicate on a more daily basis, more so rather than just a passive editing. So we came up with a model where we do like daily huddles in the morning, and we found a time that is 7:30 a.m. Pacific time is the one that works for between all of us. It's not too late for somebody who's in Southeast Asia. It's like 10 p.m. It's like not also, in Latin America, it's about East Coast time. So typically 7 a.m. is like 10 a.m. for them. So it's like it works for us. Yeah, we have to wake up a little bit earlier, but like, got to do what you got to do. You know what
Gotta
I
do.
mean?
Yeah.
Just,
Exactly.
just gonna how it happens, at least for now, right? And so I think if we zoom out in terms of what are the core pillars of like being able to build that, number one is knowing what is the each job functions and which one of these job functions require that tapping on the shoulder kind of you know which one really need that interaction, constant Slack communication.
Mm.
Number two, then really establishing in an asynchronous space. So like how do we set expectations of what a good work is and by when? So we have this framework of like, do you know what needs to get done, by when you need to get done, and who's assigned to it? And do you know how to get it done? That's like the
Mm.
4 tests. Like that's
Yeah.
we want to make sure they have that. And once that's clear, then we let them have the autonomy. Like they can work, they can be a morning person, they can wake up early in the morning, or they can wake up late at night and do it, whatever. As long as it's done by a certain time that we've agreed upon, right? Setting expectations is clear. And then also, this is like for the management side on the team, we want to make sure that we also know, number one, what are each roles are? Where do you play your roles in terms of the team? Like our post production manager, like if we have any revision requests or any things that are not clear, we go to them. So they know their role is to communicate and become that liaison between the post production team and ourselves or the client.
Mm,
So we each know where our position is. Like Stephanie, for example, will do a lot of like client communications so that I don't have to get into the client communication. So if there's any client communication, you talk to Stephanie,
mm,
right? And then we kind of like wrap it around in like things that I would say, in my opinion, it could make or break like an asynchronous team, because what I've seen most people do too is like they just have pretty much no meeting, everything's asynchronous, and it doesn't feel like it's a cohesive team,
for
right?
sure. Yeah.
Feels like you're just okay. I'm just painting my picture into them. My boss is like 2 continents away.
Right.
I'm just getting paid every single month, and then I'm like I don't have any connections with this person, whatever, right? So the way we do that is like we typically have one all hands meeting every week,
Mm,
and we have another one that is like kind of department specific. So one department for the editing team, because that's our biggest one. We have that on Thursdays. And we have our all hands on Monday, and we use that as a way to gather and kind of like share insights, things that you've learned in the last week. Hey, like today, for example, we talk about some like AI tools they've been using to create graphics, and it kind of creates that camaraderie, and everybody at
yeah.
the same time, everybody had
So
their
shared learning and everything.
yeah,
Yeah.
shared learning, and everybody had their cameras on. We had the expectation, like, hey, if you can have your cameras on, it makes it easier. Obviously, it's not perfect, but we do that cohesively and consistently, and that kind of creates that kind of togetherness. And sometimes even once a quarter or something like that, we have like a gathering, like hangout. What we do, we usually play like online games or something like that, where we would get everybody, hey, buy your own dinner, sit with us and play something like Kahoot or something.
Mm,
And to kind of put a little cherry on the top for me myself, like ideally, I want to be able to visit them like once a year.
yeah.
That way, like seeing them in person. For example, we saw them recently in December. At least a lot of my Indonesian team. I haven't met my Latin America team yet, but really, that's kind of like how we built that culture. And it's something that, again, culture is like develops and grows with you, and so something that we watch out for. So that's a lot of info there,
No.
but that's kind of essentially how we run our asynchronous team, kind of like to execute.
Yeah, no, thanks for sharing that. And no, it's not a lot. I think it's important to really paint a stark picture to
Yeah,
our listeners of what that looks like in this remote kind of environment. How is it like to work with someone or to lead somebody that you've never even met in person? Which I will say I have a new business partner who I met through TikTok, and I met her for the first time like in
mhm.
January. So I know it's weird to finally see that person in person. But tell me a little bit about that. How do you lead somebody that you haven't met in person?
That's like an interesting question, because like I I think that's where an advantage when I came into the workforce is like everything was already in the COVID mode in a
Hmm.
way. So I never even experienced having an in person like environment. Like, to
Mm,
be quite honest,
interesting.
I never gone to the office to do stuff other than when I used to work at Hollister, right?
Mm,
So I didn't really have that almost like picture of what that is like. So we kind of just make it work. Whereas like,
mm,
well, we go through regular like interviews and all that different stuff and qualifications, and when they kind of sign with us, we start working together. There's an onboarding process, and we meet through an online situation. But we never really thought about it. I mean, it's just kind of like the way it goes, and we understand that it's a different way of leading than the ones that are like, you can just tap on your shoulder. So, and we tell them kind of like straight up, especially like for example, our Latin America team or social media side, like, hey, your days probably you can have a way to structure your days, but we expect you to be online during this time of the day, because that's typically where our team is awake in the Pacific Coast or the East Coast time, right?
mm,
So for them, their 10 a.m. is our 7 a.m. So I'm like, hey, you don't have to start work till like about 10 a.m. all the way till like probably like I don't know 6 p.m. or something like that. And it's
mm,
probably gonna be like on and off, right? And depending on your tasks and stuff like that. Same goes with our the team in Indonesia, for example. we have our meetings. Typically, they start as like 10 p.m. your time, all the way till midnight your time. So do whatever you need, whether you wanted to choose work at night and then finish, go through the night, or you want to work in the morning and just meet at night. Up to you. It's all up to you. But all I ask is, here's the expected things that I want you to do. I want you to show up during this time once a week. It's not even that crazy, right?
Right.
Um, and for the post production manager to have to kind of work, I call it like a blending time zones, because he usually works until about 2 p.m. our time, which is like about 4 in the morning his time, and then
Mm.
he would like go to sleep. We think about it like a night shift, like when
Yeah,
you're a nurse,
for
something like
sure.
that, it's like a night shift type of work. But we've kind of like laid out the expectation. I'm like, hey, during the day you can do whatever you need, you know, whether you wanted to sleep in and do whatever and don't get on, whatever you need to do, you need to do. The expected situation of the work is you got to do this. So, and I is that good with them? They're good. Then we kind of keep each other accountable that way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, no, I think you brought up something that I don't think enough people are talking about in terms of, for a lot of the younger generation, as you shared, they didn't have this experience of working in an in-person office. They only have the experience of working remotely during the 2 years that we were in isolation.
Yeah.
And I think there's so much to say about how that's going to impact the way that they interact with the world of work. But we don't have enough time to dive into that. But you point out also, did you want to say something?
I was gonna say something really quick on that. I think that's the part of the biggest piece too. Is like, if you want to make it happen, the way and this is like learning from my mentors as well, like Hermosi and everybody that I've talked over the years, is like, when trying to do something right, I always look at, is this like physically impossible to do?
Mm,
Like, has there been any case study of similar things that has happened before? Like, for example, like I know that there is creative agencies that are doing similar things that what we do, or even better, that are having team all remote.
mm,
And I'm like, so it is, in the laws of physics, it happens. If
yeah.
in the laws of physics it happens and it can function, now it's in a matter of like, I'm just not skilled enough to get there.
Yeah.
And that we can solve. That we can solve for X, Y, and Z, right? If it's physically, laws of physics says it can't possible, then it's not possible. So I think
Yeah.
breaking that beliefs in the first thing, and that's like, hey, yeah, like we can work with multiple different times, and we just need to. It's just gonna be different. It's not.
Yeah.
Don't expect it to be the same, but which one's more important to you,
For sure.
right? So,
Yeah.
yeah,
Well, again, I appreciate what you shared in terms of the infrastructure that you put in for your team to really manage the asynchronous work. Because for the people listening who are kind of more on the side of return to office, they're really thinking about that operational reality of, if somebody in California, for example, needed an answer from somebody in Jakarta or the Philippines, there's potentially a 15-hour, 16-hour delay in
correct,
in that communication, and so in a traditional office, that delay would be a bottleneck, but in a
for sure.
remote office, it's really just a regular Tuesday. And to your point, it really comes down to the infrastructure that you build, the
Mhm.
system that you put into place for collaboration that really determines how effective your team is at navigating that type of work environment.
Exactly, and I think it all comes into the expectation is like, hey, if let's say I have a team in Jakarta and I want them to work US hours for whatever reason, for whatever the role requires, right? I would present that expectation to them like, hey, I need you to be on from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. Pacific time, which is going to be basically your whole night. Is
Right.
that, can you execute that? And
And allow
you'll
them to
see
choose.
whether or not, yeah,
Yeah.
and whether or not that is feasibly possible. And I've had people before, not saying that I haven't, where they've said they could and then they couldn't, and that's okay. It just doesn't mean to be for the role. And
Yeah.
then as a business owner, now I'm looking at, okay, is this role, like, can I do this somewhere else that is not in that area of the world, right? Like,
Mm,
let's say that's where we kind of go into Latin America. For a lot of our times in Latin America, those work that they're doing is a bit more time sensitive, and we need more a bit of a back and forth communication. Now, can we work with a 2 to 3 hour time difference? And we decided, yeah, we can. Well, then again, I think depending on there's other spots around the world too where you can, like, depending on where you are, and I think really understanding what's required of the role and really understanding of like what is the expectation of that role. And as long as that's communicated between both parties, I think that's helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's talk a little bit about the engagement side of things, right? Because you've
Good.
talked about the infrastructure, but in terms of how that translates to engagement, what we see with a lot of remote managers is they use surveillance to force engagement, right?
Mhm.
So they're tracking keystrokes or making people stay green on Slack, or on Teams, they're looking at activity reports. It's
Yeah.
a system that's really built on paranoia and micromanagement, not purpose and alignment. So when we talk about engagement, it really requires a lot of trust, right?
Yeah.
When you can't physically see your team working, how do you measure your engagement? How do you know if one of your employees is thriving or burning out when your primary interaction with them is through a screen?
Yeah. That's a great point. And I'm not in support of those like time tracking or I mean, okay, time tracking is a bit different. But
Right.
keystrokes, like all that
Mhm.
screen monitoring, I think that's like big brother stuff. Like I
Yeah, for
I
sure.
don't like those. We don't do those with our team. So what the way we do it is by an actual output of what gets done.
Hmm.
This is kind of like at the simple of this, like what do we want them to do, right? We want them to get things done.
Right.
And whether that thing's done meaning a video or that thing's done meaning a bigger project that requires multiple stages, right? Things, I mean, at the end of the day, things just need to get done,
Yeah.
right? And so I kind of have trust in the team in terms of, okay, what do we got to set deadlines on what needs to get done. From a video perspective, like our editors, like, okay, we've tried out different models and we come across like if it's a 60-second video or 90-second video or less, that's typically a 24 to 48 hours turnaround, at least for a first draft.
Mhm.
Okay, so that becomes a standard. Hey, like this is a standard everybody's agreed to, and you can work kind of like how it usually is. And if it doesn't work, communicate it to us, and we'll see whether or not that's done or not. So that's the one way that we do things. We kinda engage with them in a deadline perspective and kinda what actually gets done. What's the actual output, and whether or not the output actually done well during that time. So that's number 1. And we also, typically have, one-on-ones with the team. We do it, like, once every 2 months or once every quarter with everybody on the team, and everything is done on Slack. So things communicated through there. If things are unclear, we also have Notion and ClickUp that we use for project management. So everything is on there. There's like receipts of like when things are being asked. And if things aren't clear, then we kind of talk to them. Be like, hey, where is this? Is there any bottlenecks here? Like part of our goal this year is to be able to identify bottlenecks quicker. So what we've implemented, for example, is we have a specific Slack channel like on the editing team side where all right, every time you go into, work, quote unquote, like tell me what client you're working on, which videos you're working on, if there's any bottlenecks there. That way my
Mhm.
post-production manager can come in and see if there's anything, let's say like we need B-rolls or we're missing like voice or we're missing pieces or whatnot, right? And yeah, that's kind of like that's how we engage with them. And it relies a lot from our side as a leaders, like on the trust to them
Yeah.
and we don't have to make these kind of small rules of like, oh, like I'm gonna watch your cursor move. Like I don't care if their cursor moves or not. What
Right.
I care is like if the video is gonna get done.
Right.
If this
Yeah.
if this project gonna get done, right? And that's speaking from our line of business too. Like if you own like an engineering field, there'll probably be a different business model than
Sure.
we are, right? So there's contextual base in that, there's nuances. But I think at the end of the day, we track things from how things done. Now, one thing that we do also is we do track the times of our people, and we do track that especially for our management team. And the way we do that is not to be able to like, oh, what are you working on today? In a way, but we kind of use that as a more of a time allocation base for capacity. So hey,
Mm.
let's say for this specific client, because in an agency space, like we have to track what their time is and all that stuff. Like, why are we
Sure.
spending this much time? It's kind of a little bit over the hours here. Is there any problems and issues? What's going on, right? So we look at that usually every week to kind of see like, okay, maybe we have more capacity, maybe we have less capacity, or are we like stuck and everyone's kind of like at their limit and we need to get more people? And that's kind of brought into your point. That's how we avoid burnout and all that stuff.
Yeah. No, I think that's amazing. Like you've absolutely created kind of, again, for lack of a better term, a machine, although it's not really that. There is a lot of human involvement in that, but you've done it to a point where it's so structured and intentional. Like there's so much intent around the structure that you're creating, and it's supported by the
Mhm.
level of communication that you put in place that it keeps it running smoothly in that type of challenging environment. So I think that's incredible what you've built there. And again, for those who are listening, it's really a point to take away of you have to have that level of intentionality around how you're creating these systems in order to support the model that you're trying to build, the infrastructure that you're trying to build.
It reflects a lot about you as a leader as well. It's like,
Yeah, for
you
sure.
know, the intentionality, kinda like how you bring, like, what is this thing that you're building? You can't just throw something together and say like, "Yeah, we're just
Yeah.
gonna do this," and you yourself not wanna honor the system,
Right. Yeah.
right? And then you can't do that. Like, if they see you doing that, and like your team is like, well, if the
I'll do it
manager,
too.
yeah, they're not even honoring the system. They're expecting it. Like, why am I supposed to do it? Like, they're supposed
Right.
to be the example, right? So
Exactly.
I challenge myself. I like if I'm the leader of the company or whatever your role is, you're leading people. You have to set the bar. You have to set the example. Because I've heard this somewhere where it's like your like your worst would be their standard, their baseline
Yes.
standard, or something
Yeah.
like that. So you know, you have to create such a big, like, if you actually you got to commit and actually do things, exceed the standard, because they're only going to look at your very very baseline standard
Right.
as a at their standard, right? And
Yeah.
not saying like that's all with everybody, but like generally speaking, right? That
Generally
creates the
speaking, yeah.
culture, you know.
Yeah, 1,000%. Well, let's talk about the flip side of engagement,
Let's do
which
it.
is disengagement, right? And
Sure.
it's really the elephant in the room when it comes to the conversation around remote work. Because when we talk about disengagement or engagement, the metric that really is the number one measure of that is turnover, right?
Okay.
In a physical office, when someone leaves, there's really a tangible transition. You see them packing their desk. There might be a goodbye, thank you for what you've done lunch, but in a fully remote asynchronous setup, a team member can simply log off, their avatar goes away, and they're gone.
Yeah.
It can feel incredibly abrupt. Combine that with the accepted standard that younger generations are chronic job hoppers, and it sounds like a recipe for constant instability in that type
Uh,
of environment. What has your experience been with turnover in what I call a borderless company? So when one of your
I like
key
that term.
players leave, how do your asynchronous systems absorb that operational shock? And really, from a leadership perspective, how do you protect the morale and the engagement of the remaining team members who are suddenly picking up the pieces across, again, 4 different time zones?
Yeah. First of all, I like that borderless company. That's an
Borderless,
interesting
yeah,
one. I like that term. That's why I'm
yeah,
gonna steal
you
it.
can have it.
Yeah. It's actually a really good question because it's very timely, and I'm very transparent. I think within the last 2 months and being on the year, we lost like 3 of our team members, actually 4 of
Mm,
our team members. Um, 1 because they choose a different career path, and 3 from, you know, kinda just changes in the company and stuff like that. You know, typically when a big flow of clients leave, we don't have any work for,
mm,
and that's kind of the agency side. Like, you know, we don't want them just sitting around doing nothing,
yeah,
and
for
have to
sure.
let them go. And I think there is something to say about that, like quiet loneliness kind of thing, and just everybody get, oh, things been removed on Slack, you know, and
Mm,
Amazon has that. So I think that is something that even for us, like we're still like trying to decide like how what is a proper offboarding process is. Obviously, like getting you know, getting all the accounts back, changing all the passwords, all that different stuff is like the standard stuff. But one thing that I've done recently, especially with this most recent experience, is like I again, depending on what the reasons are, the way we've done is like I address it in our all teams where it's like, hey, here's like here's the elephant in the room. People are not with us anymore, you know, and there's a couple of different reasons on why that is. I didn't have to go too deep into the reasons, but more so I kind of use that as a way to like kind of go into the story or the narrative that like we are almost elevating and upgrading ourselves as a team. Again, depending on the reason what this view is, and we wanted to, you know, grow in this new direction with them, right? And as far as like absorbing those shock, I think those shock will always be there, especially if they're a key player. Like it's definitely felt. It's like, okay, well, you know, because we operate on a pod structure, they own that whole pod, and like
mm,
now we have to scramble and look into what are the different things that needs to be done in that pod, right?
yeah.
And from an operational perspective, I just look at it as okay. Again, this is very nuanced to like the creative agency space, but I look at it as like we need a transitional training piece where it's like uh, part of my goal for the next quarter in Q2 is to be able to, I call it like, create a SOPs for everything.
Mm,
Like we should have standardized operating procedures as much as possible on how these things would happen and how when we need to transition certain things, document that so that other people are also trained to be able to do that. So I think that's kind of like the hedge against things like that to happen is to have a really strong training system
mhm.
and really knowing how to transfer the skills because especially in our industry it's everything is a we're basically a service company, right? And in a
Yeah,
service company people is the game. So the quality of our service will be determined on how well we are at teaching others how to do that skill.
yeah.
And so yeah, that's kind of part of the ways that we do it. It's like okay, let's it kind of opens up blind spots for us.
Well, I think you speak to a lot of really important things, but one thing that really I think is an important takeaway for people who are listening is, there's this whole conversation on social media around the corporate world and how broken it is and how toxic it is and how the corporate world and the corporate 9 to 5 is dead.
Hmm.
But I think something that you pointed out that's really important is that there are a lot of things that we typically learn in the corporate environment that allow us to operate better in an entrepreneurial environment. So systems thinking and standardizing operations. A lot of entrepreneurs go into entrepreneurship and they just do, right? They just react.
Yeah.
They don't think about standardizing operations. They don't think about documenting things. And that ends up hurting them down the road. And you're a little bit different because again, you didn't have significant exposure to the corporate world, but you just have intelligence. But
Maybe that's what
for
we want to call it. That's good.
for a lot of people, like they have to experience that in the corporate environment so that they have that knowledge, that awareness, that skill to apply that in their entrepreneurship journey of, okay, I have to standardize this. I have to turn this into procedures. I have to document this so that when I do have turnover, there's continuity and I'm not starting
Mhm.
over. So I think that's important for people to take away of like, sure, there are things about the corporate environment that suck, that are toxic, that are broken, but there are also a lot of things about that environment that teach us how to do things better in an entrepreneurial environment.
Oh, 1000%. Yeah, I think, when you're working for a certain company that's already ideally not too large where you're still making contribution in the team, like there's so much to learn about what they've built, right? It's like reverse engineering things in a
Yeah.
way. I remember when I used to work for the marketing agency, when I was getting on board, I was like, oh, I was learning about how they structure their team, how our department works with the other departments of like account management or all that stuff, right? About how there's a standardized document that they have on how to run paid ads on Amazon, for example, right? And I think being the entrepreneur is a little bit interesting switch of a mindset, mine
Yeah.
more so because I think you got to always like teeter totter, because your time is very
Sure.
limited,
Yeah.
right? And you as a person, like you got to figure out what is your strength and what your strongest suit is to be able to utilize that time. And sometimes you are needed more in the operation side, or sometimes you're needed maybe in more like marketing and revenue generation side,
Mm,
right? Like depending on what it is. And the thing is like tools always change. There's always new ways to change. That's why big companies have R&D R&D departments. Just really like
mm,
their whole job is to figure out how to make the product better,
right. Right.
right? And in a smaller company, like you don't have anything like that. You are the R&D department. You know what I mean? And so I think again at different levels they have different advantages and play
Right.
cards that you get to deal with. And so as an entrepreneur, I think like at least in our current stage of the business is like okay, what is that most important right now that the business really needs to grow? And if it was up to me, if I have like 50 hours in a day that I can work on, I would standardize every single thing from top to bottom, X, Y, and Z, right? But that's
Yeah.
just not realistically, you know,
Right.
ideal in terms of how I use my time. And so how can I fit that balance between how do we stay on top of our marketing, but also at the same time fixing these things, or how do we delegate that maybe to other people like that can do that? Like, so for
Mm,
my example, for my post production person, I'm like, hey, can you document some of these processes that we have when we are onboarding a new client on new stuff? I'll teach them how to create a process map. I'll teach them how to create SOPs. I'll teach them how to create, Loom videos about X, Y, and Z, and then we work together on that, right? So, yeah,
Yeah. No, I love that. And it makes me want to dive deeper into kind of your brain. This is one of the things I like to do on my podcast is like really
let's do it.
get into the brain behind the brilliance. And so I want to understand a little bit more about kind of the nuances that happen in your brain because, your zone of genius is helping CEOs build magnetic personal brands. I know exactly how powerful your process is because I was your client. And even though I probably wasn't the best client. You helped me navigate my own transition into self employment by helping me to build my narrative. And you might know this because I was your client, but my
Mhm.
core methodology in my consulting is this convergence of leadership, marketing, and strategy, which I think speaks a lot to the way that your brain operates in your business.
Yeah.
But I believe that these three are deeply synergistic. If your
Mhm.
marketing is about building trust with your audience, your internal leadership has to be about building trust with your staff, right? There has to be
Mhm.
that relationship.
Yeah.
How does your expertise as a brand strategist influence your role as a CEO? Do you treat your internal team communication and alignment with the same strategic care that you treat a client's external marketing campaign? Or do you find that there are nuances that make it hard to do that?
That's a great question. Hmm. How has it helped me as a CEO? I think that's kinda like one of those where whether I know it or not, I don't think about it as of like, "Oh, I'm using this specific skill set right now," but I think as I help a lot of people tell their stories and craft those stories and narrative, like, for me, I find it natural to, be able to craft what's our story as a business and rallying people behind that. I think that's, like, one of my strong superpowers, I guess, in a way. So, looking internally and how we do that is really what is like really the vision of the business that we're trying to achieve. What is the level of standard that we are going to achieve? I like analogies, for example, like using a lot of those in our meetings, but really thinking that through the lens of, okay, here's where I want to get us. Like, for example, we wanted to be, maybe a seven-figure plus company that operates in internationally. Like, we have plans that we wanted to be able to do business in Asia as well as the United States. Cool. This is the goal. And so how do I translate that and tell that story to our team that is, in different, whether I tell them in a group setting, in our team meeting or quarterly, the QBR or something like that, or in a one-on-one, for example. Like, how do I tell that story to these people? Because sometimes in our one-on-ones, we can go a little bit deeper with every single one of them. Like, hey, what's your goal? How can we fit you into this vision, right? Into your how you can grow? Because I'm a proponent of that. I think, a lot of our team members have worked with us for a long time now. Like, some of them are like 2+ years since the very beginning. So,
Mhm.
uh, we kind of keep them on, wanted to keep growing with them. So I don't know if that answers your question, but
Absolutely.
I think as a CEO, like, because you have to wear so many hats, and I think in this stage of our business at the moment is really how do we carry that story of us
Yeah,
and really make people feel like they're working for something. So
for
one of the
sure.
things that first I say a lot of people do, and this is like over the years I've realized this, when they're hiring somebody from remotely or overseas or wherever, it's like they don't spend enough time like actually like telling them why they should work there. Like, yeah, this is like a job, pays the bills, maybe it pays a little bit more than what you normally could get, whatever, right? Whatever the things, but like, what's their story that the reason why they're on board of this ship, right?
Yeah,
Elon Musk, for example, love him or hate him, he's great at doing that. Like, his story is like, hey, we're gonna go to Mars. And if you're onto that, like, you join us, right? And you join us and we
yeah,
build cool stuff and go to Mars. And if you're, it's gonna be hard work, it's gonna be, sometimes even like, no sleep, but we're gonna go to Mars. That's our goal. Like, he's selling that story, right?
yeah,
And so I think it's important as well to be able to communicate that to the team of like
yeah,
what are we actually trying to build and how their contributions will have an impact towards that. And
yeah,
what would they get out of it too? Like, it's not like, whether it's monetary or maybe even like in other ways that would make them feel like appreciated for their work, right? So
yeah.
that's kind of stuff that I'm thinking about.
Yeah, I love that. And you honestly, you echoed A couple things that John Elbing and John Formica talked about in their episodes prior to yours, like John Elbing was talking about his framework for story building and this notion of having to like bring everybody into the story with you. If you haven't listened to it, go listen to it. Not you specifically, but the audience. But in that framework, he kind of challenges this traditional storytelling framework that marketers have come to learn for many years now, and
Mhm.
he gives a little bit of a nuance to be more story building in the sense that you're not just telling people the story, but you're bringing them into it. You're bringing in their experience, their nuanced perspective, and you're creating this story together. And
Mhm.
then John Formica in the episode after that, he's the ex Disney guy, and he was talking about how, the core of how Disney built their culture always came down to telling people why they were hired, why they're there, like what's that purpose, that role that they have in the organization. So what you just said now perfectly echoed what they said. So for those listening who haven't listened to those episodes, I encourage you to check those out because it dives deeper into what Brandon just talked about right now. And something that you also said is, this need for people to contribute. And when I was developing my framework, I've learned a lot about Adler and his Adlerian psychology. And one of the things that he talks about in that is that as humans, we have a fundamental need to feel like we're contributing to
Right.
to a community. And naturally, we form communities through physical spaces. And only recently, since the pandemic, have we really figured out what this remote environment is like. And so, when your team is scattered across the globe, that organic community tends to be a little bit more challenging to do. So, I think to your point, making sure that you have that shared story and that you're constantly communicating that is crucial to your ability to really build that community around your mission, your vision, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, and I'll add to this too. I think we kinda brushed against it earlier when, we talk about the having to monitor the clicks and all that
Yeah.
stuff. I think that all comes from, like, not trust, you know what I mean? Like, the untrustness of, like, the organization and the team.
Yeah.
Because, like, one of our core values in the company is extreme ownership. So, like, if you
Mm.
own something, this is whatever it's a task, you gotta own it, ask when you need whatever, like, you need, because, like, we're a small enough company where you have to play your part,
Yeah.
be you're a part of you contribute to the end goal of everyone, and you're kind of the you don't wanna bring anybody down. You wanna lift
Mm.
everybody up, right? And so in order to get that ownership, like, they have to feel like they own a part of the story,
Yeah.
right? Because if they don't feel like there's a connection why I'm doing this, or, people have probably already, done hiring freelancers or hiring, like, people from Fiverr, a lot of different stuff. Like, there's no connection to that. You pay them and then they do your work and they're gone, right? Which is,
Yeah.
there's a whole model for that. But what I'm saying is, like, if you really wanted to build that kind of company where we motivate people and actually grow them and want them to succeed genuinely, whether they're remote or they're in person, I think you got to have that buy-in from them as well, and why they do what they're doing is going to result to something, right?
Yeah, for
Yeah.
sure. This is not sponsored, but Extreme Ownership by Jocko Willink. Go read that if you
Oh,
haven't
that's a book.
already. It is a book. You haven't read it?
I haven't read it.
Oh, so he was like one of the pioneers of this concept of extreme
Oh,
ownership.
interesting. Look it up.
He's like this like old or ex Navy SEAL.
Uh-huh.
And the audiobook is actually a lot better because he has this like really deep, strong
Okay.
masculine voice. So if you like audiobooks, I recommend that you listen to it because it's a lot better. But his book, Extreme Ownership, is like what really set the precedent on this whole notion of extreme ownership.
Yeah.
And like a lot of mentors and like speakers have alluded to it. Not that I don't think he's like the person who coined this term, but he really like
Right.
put this into a framework. So if you guys haven't listened to it, go listen to it.
I didn't listen to
Um,
that. No, I didn't know that
it's a
exists.
great book. His books are really good. So check them out.
I love
Um,
it.
okay, so let's talk a little bit about, as we get to the end of this episode, I think something that's important to talk about is this kind of generational divide that exists in the workforce right now. Because as I mentioned in the episode, you bring really this like younger Gen Z native understanding to the world of work. And older generations often view the Gen Z demand for flexibility and remote work as lazy or lacking loyalty, right? And
Mhm.
I completely disagree. I think it's a demand for more fulfillment and more alignment. over just clocking FaceTime on your time card, right? So, as a Gen Z founder, which I never even asked like, if you are a Gen Z,
I
like,
am a Gen
okay,
Z.
I
I'm
just
an
I
older Gen Z.
I should have probably clarified that, but I
No,
just
you're good.
assumed. So, as a Gen Z founder, how do you redefine what a strong work ethic looks like today in this remote kind of environment? If it's not sitting in a chair for 9 hours a day looking busy, what is it?
That is so I love that question because I think I use that principle even in my own work without knowing that it is, what is that principle of work? What is work? I think a couple of things. I think it's inputs and outputs. That's basically as simple as it is.
Mm,
Is what are you doing? What are your inputs? Whether it's in a company or what you do, what your job, like what focus on what your inputs are
mm,
that ideally will generate an output,
mm,
right? No matter what level that you are in, like sometimes when you're maybe a little bit newer on the coordinator side level, right? Like you may be told what your input should be, right? And then because somebody that is more senior would know if you're doing that input, you'll be expected this output, which will benefit the whole thing, right?
mm,
And when you start to get more senior, you kind of know, okay, what kind of inputs you need. Now you have many inputs that you can do.
yeah,
What kind of inputs do you need to choose to achieve certain outputs, right? But I think at the end of the day, at least the way I even run my own work and how I judge, myself and whether or not what's my work is as input and output. It's like I'm as a CEO need to generate these type of outputs within the company to grow it, to get it to a certain level, X, Y, and Z. And now I need to focus on my inputs of what that needs to be. And that's kind of how we treat the team. The team, hey, here's a certain required inputs that you need to expect it to do. And then in result, there should be because we can't control the output sometimes, right?
sure,
We can control it at a certain point, but we have belief or theory or hypothesis, whatever you want to call it. If you do this inputs, it will help us do X, Y, and Z, right?
mm,
So I think to break it down to a very core level, the way I see it is that it doesn't matter what environment you're doing it in. I don't really care what medium, as long as it gets done, right? Like
mm,
whatever the input is, you actually do it. You don't need to be in an office or all that. I mean, if you want, sure, if that works for you, sure, go ahead, do it. But um, at the end of the day, I think in a philosophical side, on a very, very large philosophical side, right? Like the way progress is made is just like humans doing things, and then things will get produced as of that input.
yeah,
And that's just kind of how it is. So if we focus on what we can control, which is the inputs, we should be producing something on the outputs. It's not about, you know, I don't know. That's kind of like how I see it.
yeah.
Very simple, like raw. You
Yeah,
know?
no, well, I do appreciate that, but for the sake of playing devil's advocate, I wanna
Let's do
push
it.
back on it a little bit because,
Let's do it.
like, how do you make sure I'm not saying that it's a bad perspective, right? But how do you
Mhm.
make sure that looking at work as a series of inputs and outputs, how do you make sure that doesn't become so transactional that it removes the complexities, the human element, like, all those different aspects of the work relationship?
I get that question, and I think there's two different definitions there. I think the way I define work is definitely that it is a transactional kind of almost like an energy type of exchange of like we're doing this and that, right? How do we get there? That's where we put the human elements, I think, into the
Mm,
play, right? I think there's different ways of leadership, right? There's different
sure, yeah.
ways of call it motivating, call it like rallying people together. That's where it differs. Like at the sense of the core, the way I see work is like things that needs to get done and things that are make sure it gets done. Now, how are we getting there? That's where we kind of like have the human emotions into it. We kind of like strategically think of what kind of inputs we need to make and really getting you buy-in in terms of like how do we work together towards this big problem that we're trying to solve. So I don't think it's one way or the other. I think at the end of the day, I mean, even like if you work for a corporate, right? Even when I used to work in Ascent or any other companies, I exchange my time for a paycheck. That's kind of at
Yeah.
the end of the day, that's kind of like the basic is a transaction.
Mm,
But how I'm doing that work and the quality of that work and the quality of that input, right? That determines all these human stuff, kind of what we just talked about this whole episode, where it's like how do we make sure people don't turn over, right? How do we make sure that expectations are met clearly? Because if that's where the human part of it, like I think there's a lot of different ways on how we can get there. I think at the end of the day, work in itself is the action of doing,
Mm.
but how we are conducting that action is that leadership piece of it. Whereas like leadership of ourselves, or maybe even with a team, right?
I think that's really fascinating, in terms like, that's a really fascinating perspective, and I think it's refreshing because I think over the past 5 years, maybe since the pandemic and really this whole, like, thing that's happening in terms of the trend of questioning the world of work, I think we've started to villainize this, like, the transactional aspect of the world of work, and I mean, I would say I'm even guilty of it myself, where I've challenged this idea of, should we be transactional? Should we look at the world of work as a transactional relationship? And you made a really good point of, the transactional part is okay, but there's a lot of transformation that happens in the how. So I
Mhm.
appreciate you sharing that perspective. I really do love that, and that's getting me to think about looking at things a little bit differently.
I think it's interesting because even I face this as like a CEO, right? Like there are things that maybe not gonna be my favorite things to do.
Mm,
And maybe there are some days that I'm not feeling like doing this certain thing,
right.
but it has to get done.
Mm,
Right. And like if I truly care about the output and this vision that I want to have the team to have, I need to do this thing. And so I need to do the input so that the output would come out the other side. Right.
yeah,
And how I motivate even myself, how time block myself, how I, say yes and no to things. That is the leadership part of it, right? I
yeah.
think where you can listen to the Tony Robbins and really understand like your why and your power from within, right? And really, I think all of that stuff is true, and I do believe in all of that stuff. But think about that as like the driver of the action. The
Mm,
work is the actual action that needs
yes.
to get done, right? And so, however, whatever it takes you, you probably heard the motivation of like, carrot or the stick, right? What would get you
Right.
towards a destination? And I think, at least personally, like looking at myself, like sometimes I have to use both of like how to get the action to be done. And I think in a leadership perspective, like really understanding your team and understanding what are the inputs that is necessary to get the result that I want done, and understanding each of them specifically of like what are their strengths, their abilities, their culture. That's also important, right? Even because if they live in a whole different continent, they have different cultures. How do we set expectations? How do we communicate, motivate? All that different stuff would be the how we can
Mm,
get them towards the action.
yeah. I
Yeah.
love that. Wow, that got me thinking about quite a bit of things. So thank you for sharing that perspective.
Yeah.
Okay, so I like to give my listeners something actionable to take, from each episode. So
Sure.
for you, let's talk about kind of scaling this borderless model, right? You've proven that this model works for your studio, but a traditional CEO who's listening to this might say that that works for creative agency, but it won't work for my business. What's one universal principle of remote leadership that you believe applies to any industry, whether it's a creative studio, a financial firm, or a tech startup?
That's a great question because the first thing I will come to my mind, like that's a limiting belief. If it's like, if it's a, if the law of physics says it's possible, right? If you don't,
Yeah,
I mean, if there's a company that is like yours that is successful at doing that and having online remote team borderless companies, then it's possible. So number one, but number two, I think realizing that there's so much talent out there in the world. I think we have grown into a world where internet and AI now has become accessible
yeah,
throughout the rest of the world. And it really opens up a pool of talent of people. I sound like a recruiter, but like really that's kind of like how it is. I think that is the first belief that I have to encounter. And, I've seen this from a lot of either my friends that owns businesses that like, depending on what scale and what size, first believing that it's actually possible. Like the talent
yeah,
is there. Like you're telling me in a world of 8 billion people, there's only one person from one country that can do it.
right,
Sometimes we get caught up in our beliefs, and really something that actionable is always to challenge your belief. That's probably like one thing that I would say become very aware of that because sometimes your belief can be your own downfall because you're not
Yeah.
willing to do certain things with that. So,
Yeah.
you know, there's definitely enough talent, enough automations in this world on AI and all that stuff to be able to really supercharge a whole team, no matter where they're from, you know?
Amazing. Amazing thing to end this episode on because I really was, my follow-up question to you was going to be, what is a mindset shift that leaders need to really put into place as of tomorrow to really change the trajectory of how they're approaching this new world of work? And you just answered it right there, so no need to even ask the follow-up question. But if our listeners want to connect with you to either get more insights on leading a remote team or building their own borderless culture, or if they want to work with Fortino Studios to help tell their story and get their brand out there, what's the best way for them to connect with you?
Yeah, there's a couple of different ways. If you want to look me up on LinkedIn, is Brandon, BrandonFortino, Fortino. You can always contact me there. Our website is fortinostudios.co. So if you wanted to check that out too. And I think if you just Google search my name, there's a couple of different ways to choose social platforms that you enjoy most, and I'll respond there.
Sweet. Well, Brandon, thank you for proving that culture isn't a place that you go to, it's the systems and trust that you build. And for our listeners, we've just seen what the future of work looks like when you stop fighting reality and start designing for it. To get more insights like this that help you define what the future of work could look like for you, your team, your business, hit that follow button or subscribe button and join us again next week for more transformative insights. I'm Clarence Moore, and this is Aligned, Engaged, Fulfilled. We'll see you next time.